silence your cell phones. Okay, welcome to the June 9th, 2021 meeting of the Government Relations Committee. I'll call the meeting to order. Dr. Siebert, can you please verify that the meeting has been properly posted?
Yes, it has, Ms. Reinicek.
Thank you. Now is the time for citizens to speak. Do we have anyone that would like to address the committee? Yes. We have Laurel Peterson today. You can come on up, Laurel. I'm just going to read a brief statement. As past practice, each individual will be limited to 3 minutes time to speak in order for us to hear from our community and then get on to the agenda of our meeting. I'll signal you at 2.5 minutes in order to allow a wrap-up for your comments. We expect you to honor our time limit, refrain from using any inappropriate language in any manner, and be respectful in your comments. If you do not meet these expectations, you may be prohibited from speaking at future committee meetings. And please silence your cell phone. And, okay, Laurel, take it away.
And I am, congratulations. Today is the last day of school for the district. I know it's been a long year, and along the way, I am sure that many people wondered if we were going to make it to this day. But here we are, thankfully, and a huge thanks are owed to you, but more importantly, our administrators and teachers. Year. Hopefully next year, I know it will still have a lot of challenges, but won't be quite as hectic as it's been this year. I think we'll all welcome a bit of a return to normal, but unfortunately, there are still, of course, still be some challenges post-COVID epidemic that we are going to have to face. You know, fault of anyone's here, the pandemic just changed things, and our students unfortunately bore the brunt of some of that. There are definitely some learning deficits that we're going to have to work to make up for through things like the PATH program that was updated and presented to the Teaching and Learning Committee last week, of course, special education funding. Anytime that we can get the most advantageous teacher-to-student ratio will also help to try and get students back to where they should be going forward, so that 10 years from now, COVID will just be a small blip in the road of their path. So because of that, I wanted to speak to you here today about the I believe is woefully inadequate for the challenges that we'll be facing here in Waukesha and, of course, throughout the state. I urge this committee, and by extension also the superintendent, the administration, and the board at large, to publicly speak out. Dr. Mark Hansen of the Elmbrook Superintendent has spoken in opposition to it, as well as Roberta Darling of River Hills. We need to get partisan politics out of education, and we need to meet the needs of our kids. So please follow the lead that SWSA and these other leaders have put forth. We are watching.
Sorry, just trying to put my notes together. I'm writing down what you said, and thank you for your comments today, Laurel. Okay, then we are going to move on to our action items. The minutes for approval are the March 1st, 2021 Government Relations Committee minutes. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
And a second? Okay, any discussion on those? All in favor say aye. Aye.
I abstain.
Opposed, say no, and we have one abstain. Okay. We are going to move to the 2021 through 23 School District of Waukesha Legislative Priorities document. I'll turn this over to Dr. Siebert.
All right, thank you, Ms. Reinacek. So this will be familiar to two of you. Anthony, I believe we included this in your transition packet, and this was work that came out of this committee, which I think the committee should be proud of. And we looked at one of our most recent meetings, recommendations from the National Superintendents Association, the Statewide Superintendents Association, the SWSA, which we've talked about in this committee frequently, and tried to piece together in any situation, and in the next agenda item, Darren will talk about the JFC recommendation and the overall state budget. In any of these discussions, there are 400 plus school districts in the state of Wisconsin, and some things are advantageous to some districts while they may not be advantageous to others. And so what we tried to do, as you'll remember, is put together some of the pieces that we thought were important to the school district of Waukesha. And so we had public education funding, so increasing special education funding, which we'll talk about in the next agenda item. Some ideas to use the rolling averages differently, like 2019 summer school was very advantageous for the school district of Waukesha. 2020 for us, as well as most of the school districts in Wisconsin, since it was virtual, was a struggle, and that number gets calculated into your overall student count for your revenue on a rolling basis. So we were looking at, could we do something different there? And then there's just a number of other areas within this piece. We talked about mental health and early learning funding. Those certainly have incredible deficits, and our speaker just talked about the PATH program that we did learn about at Teaching and Learning, which is a great example of how we already are trying to do those things, but there's always more need, particularly with the pandemic and ongoing mental health issues. And then we also talked about local control, specifically that around the calendar and allowing local school districts to have more autonomy when it comes to creating their calendar as opposed to the mandatory September 1st start date. So we just thought it might be a nice piece to just kind of refresh that for us as we go into Darren's discussion in the next agenda item of what does the state budget look like. These were the things that we thought were important. Now, what did the governor recommend? What is joint finance? What are they recommending, and where does that intersect? So any questions on this particular document?
Yeah, on the part that it talks about local control, could you expand on that a little bit more? Specifically, you said the start date of September 1st. I know there's a problem with the calendar and the budget lining up, correct? That's part of that issue?
Well, there is some of that. So yes, school districts' budgets start July 1st.
Okay.
And the levy gets set by the end of October. You start school already, you start spending money for that budget already in July, and then you start school September 1st, so that's a state mandated start date. And one of the things, it's primarily around the tourism industry and allowing the month of August to be open for families to travel and kids to work and all of those pieces. But the tourism industry certainly impacts different areas of the state differently. The Door counties and the Wisconsin Dells look at that very differently than for example, we do. But with that being said, there's been some, particularly with the pandemic, some thought of could school districts have the flexibility to be able to say, in our community, our board says we'd like to start earlier to be able to do various different pieces, whether that's sports starting and extracurriculars starting so that kids are already at school a lot, so let's just get going in the third week of August or the second week of August, whatever it might be. Or on the back end, the AP testing often starts the first week of May, second week of May, and then after that, kids are done with those classes. So to the extent that we could get more curriculum in before they took those tests, that would be advantageous to their performance. So those are a couple of the drivers, but in regards to overall local control, that's always been something I think that's important for school boards to be able to make the decisions that are in the best interest of their community. Because you're elected by the people to make the decisions that make the most sense for the school district of Waukesha. And so anytime we can get out of state mandates, in the case of a calendar, I think there's benefit to that, if that helps.
It does. And then on the second point there, opting out of unfunded mandates, what are some examples of that?
Would you like to take some of those, Mr. Clark?
Even a lot of them are the amount of testing. That's one that's been brought up a lot. That's a costly process, and daily control things like that. I think it's a state level thing and a federal level thing. It can be food service programs. It can be tied to busing, all kinds of things that they establish rules. Handicap aid's more of a federal conversation, but it's a great example. In the 70s, they promised to fund 100% of all special ed costs, and now they fund 28%. That'd be probably the most financial impactful unfunded mandate that I can think of off the top of my head. Even transportation, that's percentage bilingual aid reimbursements drop down to single digits. There's numerous categorical aid types of things that they, over time, creeps always backwards financially. So
There's generally things in every budget cycle, too. Like, for example, financial literacy was something that came in more recently. Districts need to teach financial literacy. Districts might need to teach different things that are mandated from the state, but there usually isn't accompanying funding that come with that. You just have to figure out how you're going to create a plan. Academic and career planning was one that was a few years back where every student needs to have. It's a great thing. There just usually isn't accompanying funding to go with it. So you need to figure out how you are going to, generally speaking, if you can, take something off of the plate of the staff so that they have the time to be able to do those things, and then we have to align the resources as best we can.
in that case, it's more of an opportunity cost than a fiscal cost, because the school day is the same, but you're giving up some instructional program that this board might have more value in than personal finance or fill in the blank, whatever the latest topic is.
Sure. Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Okay. All right, then we're going to move on to the state biennial budget update. Mr. Clark will present this item.
I tried to follow the letter that Dr. Siebert just went through, and looking at this, and I put this, there's several other documents in there. Did you want to lead off? I'm sorry.
No.
Okay.
No.
Several documents in there on where joint finance is and where the governor's or DPI's proposal is. And I have something outlining joint finance committee's motion that came out. But I put it all into this PowerPoint, and we can certainly dive into the detail of those other documents. But I thought maybe this would help present or frame our conversation. You can bring this PowerPoint. I have a PDF of the PowerPoint in docs for you too. So here's a rough outline of the process. The governor and DPI submits a proposed biennial budget to the legislature, and then, as I mentioned in a board update a couple weeks ago, Joint Finance Committee is really where the heavy lifting and the legislature's part of this process, and this is where they really kind of frame out their discussion. Now, as we all know, we have a Democratic governor and Republicans run the Assembly and the Senate, so there's a divide and there'll have to be some compromises. But Joint Finance then approves something, and then both the Assembly and the Senate have to approve the identical budget, and then that is forwarded on to the governor, and then the governors can either veto, sign and use his line item veto authority, which is pretty extensive in Wisconsin. Both parties use it, so it's not a political thing. And then whatever the governor signs, and if there is line item vetoes, the legislature has an opportunity to try to override those line item vetoes. Rarely is that done because you need supermajorities to pull that off. So the green part's where we are now. Joint Finance has issued and approved a motion to outlining the biennial budget that they would like to see. So I'm going to go through kind of the main topic areas that Dr. Siebert just touched on and just kind of outline where the governor's at and where joint finance is at. Not make much of a statement on either one. We all have our own thoughts on it, I assume, but just to hit on the main topics. So one of the things in our legislative priorities was increase in special education funding. The governor's proposal as it stands right now is to increase funding, and there's costs that are aidable, directly tied to special ed services. Right now, for this state budget, it's 28%. The governor is recommending next year go to 45%. That's a significant increase in dollars, and then 50% in the second year of the biennial budget. But one other thing that's critical in his proposal that's different than JFC's is it's sum sufficient, meaning no matter how many aidable costs come in, we're going to pay 45 or 50% of that total. What happened last year, all the powers that be said that we were going to increase special ed funding to 30%, but then aidable costs went up, and they had to, it wasn't sum sufficient, it was sum certain, meaning the pool of money was set. It actually was only 28% by the time they did the math. So in my joint JFC motion report, I put in there, don't fall in love with percentages, because the only thing that matters is the pool of dollars that are involved. So joint finance has a small increase to 28.2% and then 30%, but they left it as a sum certain appropriation, meaning if a lot more aidable costs come in, there's only so much money to go around, and we won't know the final percentage until the math is done at the end of the fiscal year. So two main differences here, the pool of money, one's enough to cover everything and one's a set amount, and then the other is the percentages of reimbursement that they're stating right now. Resident enrollment, as Dr. Siebert said, you have a 3-year average is what guides the revenue limit calculation, and COVID certainly had an impact. In particular, last summer school, we lost, it was 65% of our enrollment, and that's a significant amount, not only for revenue limit authority, but for state equalization aid as well. So the governor's trying to give more flexibility and try to take into account, I don't know if this is a perfect fix or anything, but to let us choose whether to take the grader of 2019 or 2020 pupil count. You would want 19. And JFC really didn't talk about this. Keep in mind in these discussions, more pupils counted means more taxing authority, which means more taxation. I think that's part of why someone's at 0. Some people want more pupils counted. I don't know if taxation is the only thing, but it's government, so that's always an underlying topic. So here's the math as it stands now. The green is our actual pupil counts if nothing changes, and you can see the 48 by summer school. We were at 134 students, full-time equivalent students for summer school. I think it was our all-time high, or very near our all-time high. We'd really done a great job of expanding our summer school programming. And then it dropped to 48, and that's, like I said, a 2/3 drop. We're budgeting that we're going to make half of that back this year. We simply don't know what family. Now, we're starting to get enrollment data now, so we'll be modifying that 91 projection. But that's really what we're trying to, or what the governor, I think, is trying to fix is summer school to a great extent. The September line is our third Friday in September pupil count. That's the most important fiscal day of the year. In the fall of 2019, pre-COVID, we had just under 11,915 students. We have a natural projected decline in resident population. We've been struggling with that for many years, along with the majority of school districts out there. We dropped in the fall of 2020 to 11,532. Some of that was natural drop. Some of that could have been COVID. It's hard to tell what it was, but we're thinking some of it was COVID, so we're pretty much holding the fall of 2021 as kind of a flat count from 2020, because again, we're losing about 1 to 1.5% of resident kids per year. The governor's proposal, and I don't know exactly what the verbiage means, but I take it as we can use that 12,049 students in 2020 as well as in 2019. So you would add 12,049 to 12,049 and then our actual count in the fall of 2021 to get our 3-year average. The difference being if under joint finances stance right now, our 3-year average would be 11,760 kids. Under my interpretation and reading, and again, I don't know specifics I haven't seen in great detail, that would be 11,916 kids, and that'd be about 150 more kids. We get roughly $10,000 per kid difference in taxing authority. So this is an important topic. And there's a whole aid side of this too that lowers our levy potentially. But that's what that discussion is about. And I thought I'd go over just to kind of help frame the conversation. These are the basic funding equations for our operational costs. Number of kids, resident enrollment times a multiplier or revenue limit authority per student that the state established. Again, we're around $10,000 per student, equals the board's revenue limit authority. And that's the amount of money you can generate via the tax levy and equalization aid. And this is where the next one is, the first line really tells us, can we just pay our bills of all the things we want to do, regardless of what the funding sources are, whether it's state aid or taxation. The second line tells me, okay, here is how those funds are going to come to us, either via equalization aid or the local property tax levy. But again, the amount of money we can generate is always per pupil, the number of pupils times the revenue limit authority you have per pupil. Some communities are more sensitive to the taxation question or not. I always start the budget building process by answering, can we pay our bills? And then the second step is, what's the level of taxation the board is willing to approve? So inflationary increase, and why I brought that up is to kind of frame these positions that are being taken. One of the things in our priorities was essentially a sustainable funding system, which more than likely would come in an increase in revenue limit authority. The governor's proposal would increase $200 per pupil to that multiplier, so we would go to roughly $10,200 per pupil in the first year, and then another $204 per pupil in the second year. He also would increase equalization aid by $613 million. And the reason he's doing that is if you just raise the multiplier, that all goes on the local tax levy. If the state buys in the equalization aid and increases that, local property taxes will be more stable. These are all tax dollars, so keep that in mind. But local taxation, the property tax bill certainly gets more attention than a lot of other forms of taxation. So that's why he's doing that. So if you go back to this equation, where the orange arrow is ending, the revenue limit authority, he's raising that by roughly $200 per kid every year. But then he's increasing equalization aid, and I don't know if it's dollar for dollar or not. We won't know until we know actual pupil counts. He's raising that as well, so they're both going up by the same amount, hoping that local property taxes are relatively stable then. So that's why that $613 million is also being added to his plan. Joint finance accomplishes the exact same thing, a different approach. They have no revenue limit increase, no $200 per pupil per year. And they're also holding equalization aid flat. So everything's equal. So in theory, taxes will remain flat. We have no additional funding. Does that help? Does that make sense? So the political games all comes down to this equation. The governor's looking to increase our revenue limit authority, buy down the local property tax with more equalization aid. Joint finance is saying, let's just leave everything flat. Here's another table to kind of show you these are the bookends. If revenue limit increases, equalization aid decreases, you can have a property tax increase. The inverse is also true. And then really both sides of the political argument right now are on that bottom line. JFC is with leave everything flat. Governor's with more authority, more aid. Of course, more ongoing costs for the state, so. So timeline, it's been a long time, but it wasn't unusual for years and years and years for the state budget process to go into September. I think we even dabbled into a few days in October on occasion. But there's one true bookend that they have to meet, and that's certifying our equalization aid on October 15th. And why is that important? You can't issue property tax bills unless we certify our levy, and we can't certify the levy unless there's equalization aid. And politicians of every political party want those property taxes bills to go out. So that's your one solid guarantee, is we will have a budget. I would guess no later than October 1st, but it could be July 1st. I mean, it could go really quickly as well. The level of, and we've talked about this, I think as a board and at FNF as well, certainly, the level of the ESSER funding is certainly making this a more complex state budget deliberation. There's a lot of money out there. It's one-time money. It has some strings attached to it. It's not the cure-all because some districts in the state didn't get much for ESSER funding. You know, if you didn't have high socioeconomic benchmarks, I think a Pewaukee, you got a few $100,000. We're looking at 17 million. So it's, in terms of fixing everything, it's not that. So I think we're taking a wise approach. We identified service and budget reductions, that we are only looking to use $370,000 of ESSER funds for this fiscal year, or when I say this fiscal year, 21, 22. You know, out of a much larger allocation. So I'm envisioning us having, once we kind of know where the state is, entering into, okay, what's our strategy with the ESSER funds? It's one-time money. I would love most of that to go to one-time expenses from a fiscal approach, but you know, we don't run the district through an Excel spreadsheet either. And how do we balance that? So that those conversations, I'm hoping, will be late summer or early fall. And that's what I have. Just to give you an idea of how this can change. Here's the latest from SAAA, the Legislative Fiscal Bureau, which is the government's accounting staff, is now expecting $4.4 billion to be available over the biennial budget. And Senator Darling, who's more on the fiscal conservative side, I think I can safely say, is now supporting additional funding for K-12 beyond what Joint Finance said. And that was as of late last night, and Alberta Darling's statement was this morning, apparently. So it's still fluid. Now, whether that goes back to Joint Finance or that's handled between the governor and legislative leadership and how that conversation takes place, if it does, you know, we'll have to wait and see. But it's very fluid, very, very fluid still. And this SAA, I don't know if you guys get these emails or not, but it's a pretty good update on what's happening in Madison. WSAA.org is the website. If there's any question, I know it's a lot of information. I tried to keep it somewhat higher level, but certainly happy to answer any questions. Or so I guess the last thing I forgot to mention is a lot of this conversation is tied to what the contents of this letter to a certain degree. So whether that's in response to this letter or it's just the general topics we talk about every 2 years.
Are there any questions? Yes.
A few. Could you go back to the slides?
Sure.
Back to the first where there's the special education funding. And this isn't. I don't need a breakdown today. I'm just curious of that money that comes into the school district of Waukesha for special ed funding, whatever that total is. Do we have a breakdown somewhere of where that money goes within the district?
Yeah,
Generally, is it in the?
all special ed costs are coded in Fund 27. It's a separate silo. Fund 10's our general operational, board's expenses and Dr. Siebert's and my expenses are all Fund 10. So we don't earmark it specifically, but it helps us get to a total revenue in Fund 27. And then we have all the special ed costs on the expense side. So it's all spent directly on special ed.
Sure.
But it's not like I get a $100 check from the state and I pay it directly to, it's tied directly to a bus bill or something like that. It's not that.
Right. I'm more curious if, of whatever that money that comes into the fund, how is it dispersed generally? I don't know if you have that or if that's too important. I'm just curious for the amount of dollars that come in, where do those dollars go?
Yeah.
Generally speaking. And it's not something we have to dive into right now. I'm just curious if that exists. I'm sure it does. But.
And it does. We get just under $6 million is what we budgeted for this year in handicap aid, and that's what these percentages are tied to.
Okay.
They go to fund aidable special ed costs, whether that's special ed transportation, special ed staffing. But I don't code a individual person. It's not like a grant where you code it specifically.
Right.
It's not like that, but it's all within the special ed
Sure.
allowable costs.
Okay. The next one on summer school. So the summer school totals for 2021 are only 91.
Equivalents. We add up all the minutes of summer school,
Uh-huh.
and then we divide it by the number of minutes a regular school year.
Okay.
So this is a full school year equivalent number of kids. The number of kids actually being served is,
Yeah, it's a big formula, and you take all
Okay.
the kids that are in it, the number of days they went, the number of hours they went, and it pops out a number that says, this is your.
Because I had heard there was like 25 or 3,500 students
Yes.
participating. Okay.
yeah.
Okay. Gotcha.
It's a minute counting
Great question.
practice. And I don't know,
Gotcha. Okay.
this isn't the right number, but let's say the school year is 1,000 minutes.
Sure.
I would take the 5,000 kids in summer school and divide it by 1,000 minutes to get an equivalent
Gotcha. Okay.
September to June student.
And then finally, that down to the formulas you provided, the equations. Again, a general question, but the revenue limit authority number as a percentage and the equalization aid as a percentage for what comes to the district, what roughly is that? I mean, is it like 70-30, 80-20?
Revenue limit generates about 90% of our operational revenue budget.
Okay.
So it's substantial. So it's really the driver. That's why I always talk about resident enrollment, because
Yeah.
that's the economic engine.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
Roddy, do you have any questions?
I do not, thank you.
Welcome. I have a couple questions. When you talk about, and Dr. Siebert, when you talk about back in the 70s and the federal government promised 100% of our special ed would be taken care of, how did that come about? Was that because that's when special ed went back into the regular school
I would guess that's the
classes,
case.
or
that-
what happened then, and that now we are asking our state to make up for that? How did that come about? And
I would guess that there was a movement of where services were being provided, but I don't know what initiated that off the top of my head. But like any budget, I always argue, it's like the one-time grant you get from the federal government. We add the costs, we add the services, the grant goes away, and everyone loves the services that we never had before. It's the same kind of thing. They have budget problems and they start ratcheting back the level of funding. It's any more complex than that.
Another example would be, you might remember when the state of Wisconsin, we put the revenue limits in 1993, and then there was this promise of 2/3 funding for schools. And if you remember, like the late 90s, early 2000s, that's when everybody was building schools because they were getting so much funding. And over time, that started to just erode because it wasn't sustainable. So I'm guessing the federal example and the state example are similar. Would you like to do more as a federal government or a state? Probably yes, but when you balance all of the things that they have to fund, something probably has to give at times. The challenge with the special ed funding, though, is that we do transfer a significant amount of money from Fund 10, which is the general fund, over to Fund 27 in order to cover that.
$19 million.
So as that percentage increases, less of that 19 million needs to get transferred over, which gives us more money for general operations and putting money into the classrooms. So that kind of comes down to the rub. So, but to Darren's point, the sum certain versus the sum sufficient is a huge deal. That's really where it's all at.
Some years, most years, yeah.
Yes.
Absolutely.
To Ms. Ronichek's point, has, and maybe this is what I've been hearing a little bit, has what we call special education expanded to other services in that time frame dramatically? Or, are there more people getting special education funding, more students that may not have gotten it 20, 30, 40 years ago? Or has that been generally the same?
I would say special education percentages, Dr. Cook would be our best spokesperson on this, but they continue to increase. So we have more and more kids qualifying for services. I think if you go back to the 70s, if we remember when we were in school, like the special ed kids were kind of like in their own room. Now we have kids integrated, and we try to get them into the regular education environment, and sometimes that takes additional supports in terms of perhaps a instructional assistant to be with them. So there are more kids. There are more, I think it would be safe to say, more designations of special ed. I don't remember that there was OHI, which is other health impairment, years ago.
Yeah,
but maybe there
everything
was.
evolves, I'm
I think
assuming.
it has evolved some. Sure.
Just off of comments from Dr. Cook, though, I also think there's a level of severity increasing. The level of need of services is on average increased, at least from comments. But Dr. Siebert's right. Joe's the one to ask about that. That's out of
Dr. Siebert, to follow up to that comment in question, in TNL, we were informed by Mr. Pinion that the increased need for mental health. Does mental health services, does that fall under our special ed budget? Or that student services budget?
psychs and those types of costs are all in the special ed.
I think that's what you were looking for, too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Good point. Thank you.
Yes, good discussion on that. I have another question. When we are losing 1 to 1.5% of resident kids per year, and you say that the other districts around us are experiencing that too, so then that answers my question. Are they going to other districts? Probably not. But are they going to the parochial schools, or the parochial schools seeing this as well?
Yeah,
What's happening?
First of all, I think the true driver of it is the birth rate has been down for years. People aren't having 4 or 5 kids and like they used to, or they're waiting longer to have kids, or whatever the combination of that is. The voucher program is certainly it's drawing from a smaller pool, but the hard thing with the voucher programs is I don't, if you were to ask me to run a financial analysis of the impact, I don't know if those kids who are part of the voucher program were ever going to come to the Waukesha School District. That family might have always chosen whatever private school, so they never would have been on our radar anyway. So it's not as though I can run, I forget the number of voucher kids we have, that number times 8,000, and I know that's the fiscal impact because I don't know what family choices are. But it's not helping raise our enrollment. But, it is what it is. I want to say there's 420 some school districts now. At least half have, even pre-COVID, have declining enrollment. At least half.
Okay.
And now we all do because you all have that, or a lot more do because you have that dip in summer school, which is an artificial dip, but.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, then we're going to move on to our goals for the Government Relations Committee, and I'll turn this over to Dr. Siebert.
Oh, thank you, Ms. Reinachek. So we've talked about this. This committee, I think, is only going to continue to get stronger and have more opportunities to influence and make impact. And I thought might be good to just start to brainstorm some things, and it maybe goes with the next agenda item too, around summer legislative contacts and connections. Like, what are some things that you, as committee members, would like to see this committee do? I thought we could start a little discussion on that, and then ultimately things that Mr. Clark and I can support you in and lead or whatever that might be. So if you have some things that you would like to think about, then I think that would help you and I perhaps, Ms. Reinachek, be able to start to formulate what those goals for the committee would be.
Okay.
If that's something we're not ready for today, because we didn't have tons of preparation for you to be thinking about that either, that's something we could certainly, you could give us ideas. You could get ideas to Ms. Reinachek, you could get ideas to me, and we could start to formulate some ideas to bring back and create a goal sheet too.
Have an idea? Go ahead, Mr.
What has been the, I would assume some of this conversation is to talk with legislators in the community, in the district, correct? And get their ear, if you will. What has been outreach in the past? What connections have been made? I mean, just district-wide, as far as whether it's board members, administration, teachers. I mean, what involvement have legislators from the local level, representative centers, what has there been in the past?
Good question. Mrs. Roddy, would you be able to help lead that a little bit?
Yes, I can. Mr. Zenobia, what we've done is we've had, with our previous superintendent, we had luncheons. We've invited city, county, and state electeds to come into the district. The superintendent, Mr. Clark, Dr. Cook, came in and presented to them. Our marketing representative at the time had packets of material for those individuals who joined us, and we gave them highlights. I want to say it was around probably budget time. So we voiced some of the concerns of the district at that time. We've hosted that. That was one of the events that I was involved in. And this committee, believe we're on our third year. So that was probably our first year that we had done that. Other goals that I know that I had when we began this committee were to not only get their ear, but have our electeds in our schools. It's one thing to see, all the presentations, and another to see it in person and see it in action. So that was a goal that we also had at the origin of this committee. So that answers your question.
Yeah, so given that, what was some of the participation?
We had our county executive and one of our representatives within our district were able to attend due to schedule. So we had a couple of folks here with us. Two representatives. I don't want to. So we had two representatives and the county executive. I'm not sure how much interaction we have with our mayor. Not with this committee, maybe with the previous superintendent there were, but as far as this committee goes, I don't think that we had much with the mayor at the time. But there was, I guess for who represents us, there was a decent representation of the electeds.
This is always the peak season. The state annual
Yes.
budget is the prime time for this committee. Otherwise, it's been somewhat inconsistent because in the off year, unless there was special legislation being considered, I can't even think of an example right now. I think it's important to maintain a constant conversation with them and not just, hey, it's budget season.
Yes, and that was the idea of having them in invited into a school, seeing our programs, having regular communication going out, something probably similar to what we get on a weekly basis for updates. Sending those updates, more than likely it's going to go to someone in their office that helps keep track of those things for the legislators and at the county level, but something so that we were always on, somewhere on their desk.
Yeah. But
To continue those goals, I just said, I put regular information out to the various levels of government, just figure out a good way to do that. So, I don't know, between you and Dr. Siebert, like I said, even just something as simple as our weekly updates, but maybe monthly. I think the best way to do that is to reach out to their offices and find out who within their offices to directly contact, which staff member would be the best to direct that to. Would be a good way to do it, because most of our state electives also have their own newsletter, so to speak, that they send out, and if they catch something with a community member or what have you, they'll post it in theirs, and that's just another way to broadcast and advertise what's being done, or a need maybe that we have that maybe somebody in our community can help address.
Yeah, I should inform the committee that one of the things we have been doing with COVID, we haven't had the opportunity to necessarily meet in person, but I've tried to reach out to each of those individuals, and we have been sharing press releases and district information with their offices so that they can at least, at this point, keep up to date on what's going on in the school district of Waukesha. But I would love to, as we continue to bust out of this, have them in the district on a more regular basis and develop those relationships and be able to continue to share, to Mrs. Roddy's point, the great information that's going on within the district. So I think those are great ideas.
Excellent. For myself, yes, that as well. I know when I joined the school board in general 10 years ago, I was more active and went to a lot of functions and things like that, and would invite. And we probably had, on one tour of STEM, which was what I was a big advocate for at the time, and speaking to people about the choices that we had in Waukesha and things like that. And I think we had like 15 come through STEM when we had our new STEAM room and things like that. Like when there's something to brag about, I mean, there's a lot, but when there's a specific, then we could say this is new, come and see it. I think that there's more of a momentum where if we're like, oh, just stop by sometime, we would love to have you, then there's not a deadline, and they just kind of think, oh, okay, and then it kind of, so if there's things that are happening, things that are coming up that you guys invite us to, that would be a great way, like kind of like those end of the year things right now, the dual enrollment, which I would love to have come to yesterday. Things like that we can give advance notice to, and just showcase, like Mrs. Roddy was saying, like that luncheon that we had with them, and they came in, and when we're in passing and when we see them at functions, we can just tell them a little bit, but it's like, I wish Todd or Jim was here to just, or Darren, to say everything that you specialize in and that you know specifics of, because we just say you have to just hear it. You just have to come and see it. Or, to watch a board meeting is very long and lengthy, but sometimes to just sum it all up and give that to them. And so when they came that day, that was great that you guys put that together. But more of those. And then one time, Mrs. Roddy and I went to the Capitol, and we were able to spend the day there, and we were able to was it lobbying? Yeah, with other school board members throughout throughout the whole state, and that was, it was beneficial for us to see, but then to actually sit in a room, in a small breakout room with one of our state representatives and say, these are our needs. And so there was probably hundreds of us all there, and then we broke out and we all saw our specific person, and then there was like 5 of us at a little round table with them and saying, okay, this is what we need, this is what we're doing. And he said, well, what if we did this? Or, that was just kind of just being right in the center of it and having eye contact and saying, these are our needs, along with the piece of paper, we're going to leave this with you. But I think to get closer So, I guess to sum it all up, more interaction and just definitely having them here, us there, and just to say, we're on this. The squeaky wheel gets the oil, and just develop those relationships early and continuous.
Yeah, we'd have to check. COVID, I don't know if they used to call it the day at the Capitol. I don't know if that's even coming back but it used to be a very big event, and then I think COVID just kind of halted it for at least a year, maybe
Right.
2, I don't know. But
WASB hosted that. WASB was the host of that. May I follow up to yours? I think you and I are on the same track with this. What's the specific direct invitations? Another way to expand on that would be to find out what the interests are of our legislators. I know, for example, Representative Nealon, he's super interested in our robotics programs. If we find out what areas that they have a heart for or interest in, that'll help direct us to the invites, obviously to all, but then we know who likes what and what would be a draw for them.
That's a great point.
In addition to what we've been talking about, what functions does the district do on a yearly basis that would be attractive to invite anyone from government to? I mean, I know I've seen things come out about, there's dinners, there's golf outings, there's all kinds of things. And this, again, goes to Mrs. Roddy's point, what are legislators interested? But what are opportunities for us to invite them to something more than just come sit down and let us tell you what we need, which is our goal. But at the same time, we have a number of lobbying groups right now that are, WASB, SWSA, everybody's pushing something to funding. I understand that. But if we want a relationship with these people, how do we bring them in to say, hey, here, Ms. Roddy made a great point about Rep. Nealon liking robotics and getting him involved. What functions do we have that we can reach out and say, hey, please come and check us out here, and maybe get one or two, maybe we get a bunch to say, here's a function you're invited to, we want to meet you, we want you to get to know us.
I think some of the things that come to my mind, and obviously it's been my first year and it's been a COVID year, so we haven't had all of the functions, but some of the things I've been more recently involved with, I was just at some mock interviews over at Waukesha South and the Health Academy profession. That would be a wonderful thing for them to experience, where you get to see these very talented and very polished students in action and interact with them. We've had a couple of different dual signing days that we've had recently, where kids are signing up for when they're getting their check for $3,400 for their partnership with WCTC in order to take courses through various career pathways. I think they would hopefully enjoy something like that, because they are very much about workforce and workforce development. So, and then, when you think about, you mentioned golf outings. I mean, we have a number of activities through the Waukesha Education Foundation, and I'm sure this is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the things that we have in a typical year that perhaps we didn't have this year. Some of the things, I know there's been some involvement. I shouldn't say I know. I believe there's been some involvement with our Waukesha Made program with legislators. And so I think there are plenty of opportunities. And I wonder if through our next agenda item in terms of summer contacts, we couldn't figure out ways to get them in when it's a little less, they maybe have a little more time, and start to ask them, to Mrs. Roddy's point, what are you interested in? What types of things would you like to come to? And to your point, I think it's so important that we have that relationship, because then when they're in the throes of trying to figure out, well, does this make sense? They pick up the phone and they call us and say, does this make sense for you? And that's the goal, right? To have the friendship before we have the other pieces.
They don't want to hear from me. I could do a one-page summary, but I think send them 2 tickets to the spring drama show, or send them things that aren't come and sit down and we're going to talk at you for a half an hour, and building that friendship is a much bigger step. It's all about the kids. They want to see successful programs made and things like that fit into what employers are looking for and what they're hearing from, but it's got to be kid-centered, you know. They have to fall in love with the services we're offering, not a spreadsheet or standard talking points that 8 different legislators or lobbyists are throwing at them on a regular basis.
Right.
Yeah, if we could have a list, and I know sometimes you don't know in time, but if you're projecting, let's say we're going to have a MAID presentation, or like the signings and the interviews, and if we could have like a list of what happens in a typical year, most educators know what's going to happen, and to say, okay, these are the things that are happening. Here's the highlights that we usually have every year. Which ones would you like to come to? And then they would then say, okay, this one on these dates, and then we could have a little bigger PR about it, and to just kind of showcase. I know sometimes we'll get an invitation and it's like a week before, and I'm like, oh, because my appointments book out a couple months. So if it was in advance on a calendar and we know that that's coming, then we could present that. And then as special things come up, we could say, hey, this is added on, just so you know. But to just keep that engagement and that on their calendar and them looking forward to these things. And then having them tell others, hey, this is happening. Because I know when I used to go to a function, it was once a month early in the morning, and they were business people from all around and all sorts of legislators, and they would come, and I would go and I would talk about our school choice, and I would say, we have choices within our district. We have magnet schools and charter schools and STEM and art and all of this, and I would say, but here's all the things that we're doing, and I would brag, and I would ask Todd, what are the updates? What are we doing? And I would bring that to them, and then I would invite them on tours, and they would come. And so we have to be vocal about what's there, and then present opportunities, and then when other things come up, we'll have their information, and we can also extend those pop-up invitations.
Planetarium would be a great place to host a meeting.
Great idea.
The gem.
Waukesha offering and the beautiful facility. I'll say it so
And that's out maybe like in the fall when all the Retzer Harvest, Apple Festival, all that kind of stuff is happening. Okay.
We'll also have a number of referendum celebrations in the fall, and our polished buildings that we can get out in front of. And
then to
Right,
brag
thank you.
about what we did with trying to save the most amount of money that we could, and
there's nobody else that has a story even close to that
Okay.
from my perspective. I think that's remarkable,
okay.
what we've done here.
Because I think sometimes the fiscal conservatives like myself think, we're asking for more money, but this is what we did with it. At some point, our things need upgrading, and this is what we did with your dollars. And I know, Darren, you try to shout that from the blowhorns. Yes, but this is what we're saving, and this is what we're saving in all of those F&F meetings. But I don't know as if a whole lot of people tune in. So how else can we get that word out there?
I have nothing on Facebook, and I have nothing on views on the FNF.
Yes, because now you're igniting the event planner in me. You had mentioned the day at the Capitol, creating a day at SDW. We've all listed all of these great programs that we have, and we need to celebrate and highlight them, but we also need to show the day-to-day and the immense diversity we have across our district, what a day at Summit View looks like versus a day at Hillcrest and higher. And we have such wonderful programs within there, our dual language, our biliteracy programming that's within those schools, and create an annual event like that we can, they can have preset on their calendars, but to show the strength of our diversity across our district would be great in addition to all of these programs.
Great idea.
On some of those tour days, we were taking them to like 3 different places, And sometimes they would fall off and be like, I've got to get to a meeting. I could only make it to the one. And as we were taking them on the tours, there were so many great things that these principals are so excited about and want to highlight in the school that we're like, okay, now we're late for this one. But when we go to the WASB convention and people come from out of town, they give a list of like, here's this you can go see, this one you can go see, and then the different tours. And so different, like you were saying, different legislators have those different interests. And we could say, okay, these 5 things are happening today, or these 5 things we're going to showcase a middle school, like you were saying, 2 completely diverse, maybe elementary schools. And let them choose, and just kind of have one of those white vans shuttle people around, and let's just make an event. Thank you, guys. Great
Very good
goals
ideas.
and ideas. Good brainstorming. Okay. So we're going to move on to our summer legislative contact and connections. And again, this is for Dr. Siebert.
Right. So very similar to what we have been talking about in the previous agenda item, and even more so now, it might be great to see if we could get all of them, and I'd be happy to lead that because I've been trying to reach out to them and develop connections to come into the district this summer, just at least for a sit down and a get to know you and start to talk about some of the things that we want to start to plan and start to get some of their ideas of things they're interested in. And if that would be okay with you, I'd be happy to try and set that up and then invite all of you to join me and Darren in any of those meetings to come and connect and just start to, I think everybody's going to be much more open to that now than they probably were earlier, and fully understandable. I mean, we were in a different place. So if that sounds good, I'll start that this summer, and we'll start getting all of this put together, and we'll start to develop those connections, and I'll invite you. And certainly I know you're busy, and if you can make them, wonderful. And if not, no worries. And we'll report back out at the next Government Relations Committee meeting on how those went.
I might have been thinking about something else when you started. So were you saying that you are going to invite the legislators and us and talk about this, or is this a meeting to talk about how to invite the legislators?
I think it's just a meeting to start to connect with them deeper, and then start to talk about some of the pieces that we want to do and learn about their interests,
Okay.
and then we can even share some of the things that we're talking about in terms of goals. So I think it can be multifunctional.
Okay.
Yes, I've had some meetings, some in-person meetings with legislators, but not all of them, certainly.
Okay.
So if that sounds good, we can certainly get working on that.
Wonderful. Okay, then do we have any recommendations for future committee meetings? Okay. Well, if there's not any other new business, then I will adjourn this meeting. Thank you.